$52 million. That's how much California set aside for veterans. And that's how much sat untouched. While men who once wore the uniform of this nation slept under bridges, folded their flags into their backpacks, and faded into silence. In front of cameras, Governor Gavin Newsom stood firm, defending the programs, the paperwork, the polished promises. But then came J.D. Vance, armed not with slogans but with a name, a face, and a truth the system tried to bury. One question, just one, and the applause vanished. The room froze. Because when the truth walks in, wearing dog tags and calloused hands, even power has no place to hide. What happens when politics forgets the very people who fought for it? This story isn't history. It isn't news. But in many ways, it's something deeper. What you're about to see is a dramatized reflection, a work of fiction built on real emotions, real disappointments, and the quiet dignity of those too often overlooked. The names may not be real, but the silence, that's very real. And sometimes, the best way to speak truth is to tell a story that feels like it could have happened just yesterday. Stay with us, because if we forget stories like this, we forget who we are. The lights inside the Sacramento Civic Center were harsh, almost sterile, but the energy in the air buzzed like static before a storm. Over 500 people filled the rows of velvet blue seats. There were union jackets, business suits, veteran caps, and cameras. So many cameras. The audience had come expecting a performance. What they got was something else entirely. Governor Gavin Newsom stood center stage, polished and fluent, flashing that camera-ready smile that never seemed to crack. He spoke in the confident cadence of a man who'd said these words before: progress, equity, inclusive growth. Behind him glowed the bright, modern backdrop bearing the words Town Hall, California Forward. Every sentence came wrapped in metrics. Every answer was adorned with applause. Thanks to our administration, Newsom declared, over 74,000 undocumented families now have access to basic health services, up from just 18,000 3 years ago. That's real compassion. That's leadership. He turned slightly toward J.D. Vance, who stood just off to the side behind his lectern. Vance didn't interrupt. Not yet. He stood still, arms crossed, his expression unreadable, like a man waiting for a storm to clear so he could rebuild the house. The moderator smiled. Senator Vance, your response? J.D. leaned forward slowly, his voice lower than expected. You speak of compassion. He paused. The room, trained by years of televised politics, expected the usual volley. But something in his tone, measured, steady, almost too calm, felt like a knife being unwrapped. I'll speak of promises. A few heads in the front row tilted. Tell me, Governor. Vance looked up now, directly at Newsom. The crowd shifted. What's your plan for Sergeant Eli Brooks, a decorated Marine, 2 tours in Iraq, honorable discharge, currently sleeping under the I-5 freeway, 4 exits from your office? The room didn't gasp. It did something worse. It went still. Newsom blinked. J.D. kept going. He's not undocumented. He's not waiting for asylum. He's not new to this country. He's the reason it still stands. And yet, 2 months ago, he was denied entry to a state-run shelter because he didn't have a fixed mailing address. Imagine that, Governor. A man with no address, denied a roof because he had no address. A veteran in the 4th row shifted uncomfortably. Somewhere in the back, a phone dinged, too loud for comfort. Newsom adjusted his tie. I'm, unfamiliar with that specific case. J.D. cut in, gently but firmly. That's the problem. Camera flashes started popping again, like lightning just before the sky cracks open. You stood here and read us numbers, Gavin. Numbers that sound good, numbers that play well on headlines and hashtags. But behind every number is a name. And behind that name is a story. And right now, Eli Brooks is more than a number. He's a promise you forgot. The crowd murmured, low, electric, unsettled. People weren't cheering. They were listening. Newsom attempted to regain control. California has led the nation in humane immigration policy. And yet left a Marine to sleep in a shopping cart, JD replied, still calm. Tell me, Governor, where was the humanity then? That was the moment. Not when JD said the name, not when he described the injustice, but when he asked that final question, not to win points, but like someone asking a country to look itself in the mirror. Even the cameras seemed to stop breathing. From the front row, a woman whispered, "My brother served with him." The moderator blinked twice, then fumbled for her next card. Newsom turned toward the audience with the practiced reflex of a seasoned politician. Only this time, he had nothing to say. The silence was louder than any speech, and the story had only just begun. At first, it was hard to tell what the cameras had caught. A movement in the back row, just left of center. The lens shifted, and for a heartbeat, the production crew hesitated, unsure whether to zoom. But then it focused, and everything changed. There, in the shadows beneath the exit sign, sat a man who didn't belong to any campaign, didn't wear a blazer, and didn't hold a press badge. His jacket was worn denim, the collar frayed. His face was sun-aged, cracked around the edges like old leather, but his back was straight, his eyes unflinching. A murmur swept through the hall. Someone whispered, "That's him." The room drew in its breath as the image hit the big screens flanking the stage. Sergeant Eli Brooks. The crowd didn't gasp because of who he was. They gasped because of how he looked. Not defeated, but invisible. Like someone who'd spent years being looked through, not at. JD didn't glance toward the screen. He didn't need to. His eyes stayed on Newsom. Sergeant Brooks served 2 combat tours in Iraq, JD began, his voice steady and grounded, but now carrying weight. In 2006, he was the only surviving mechanic in his unit after an IED tore through their Humvee convoy in Anbar. He was 23, spent 3 hours holding a pressure dressing on another man's leg, his commanding officer, while taking enemy fire from a rooftop. A hush blanketed the audience. He returned home with a service medal, a bad knee, and night terrors that woke him screaming in laundromats. He applied for mental health care through the VA. They told him his file was in transit. They couldn't process his benefits without a fixed address. JD let that phrase hang in the air like a broken promise. They denied him care, he continued, because he didn't have proof of where he slept. He offered them a cross street. They asked for a ZIP code. He gave them a landmark. They gave him a form. People in the room shifted, hands tightening over notebooks, fingers curling into fists. He's been sober for 8 years. He built his own shelter out of 2 pallets and a truck tarp. He looks after 3 other vets who sleep near him under the overpass. He teaches one of them how to read. Now JD finally turned, not to the screen, but to the back row, and nodded. Eli didn't stand. He didn't wave. He just lifted his chin, barely. JD turned back. That is the man this system forgot. Governor Newsom stood silent. For the first time that evening, his posture broke slightly. Shoulders tilting back as if the ground beneath him had shifted just enough to feel unsteady. His fingers gripped the edge of his lectern, knuckles whitening. He forced a breath. Sergeant Brooks's service is, of course, honorable, and I too am disturbed by what I'm hearing. But these matters are complex. The state cannot single-handedly— Why not? JD asked softly, cutting in, not with aggression, but with a kind of disappointed disbelief. You can fund legal aid for non-citizens. You can expand sanctuary policies for entire cities. But you can't spare one social worker to walk Eli through the system we buried him in? The silence that followed wasn't political. It was personal. A woman in the 3rd row wiped her eyes. A veteran in full uniform folded his arms tightly, not in resistance, but in restraint. Newsom looked out at the audience, then at the screen still showing Eli's face. He didn't answer. And in that pause, just long enough to notice, too long to ignore, something shifted. The narrative had changed. No longer a debate. Now it was a reckoning. Governor Gavin Newsom cleared his throat, glanced down at his notes, and spoke with the calculated calm of a man who'd survived harder questions before. "We serve all humanity," he said, voice firm, clear, "not just those in uniform. Our compassion is not limited by citizenship. It's guided by principle." There it was, the pivot, the framing, The practiced moral counterweight meant to rebalance the room, but it didn't land. Not tonight. JD didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't lean forward or bristle or scoff. He simply let the pause grow just long enough for everyone to hear it crack. Then he stepped into it. Then why, JD asked softly, does humanity start at the border and end before the battlefield? The words didn't echo. They dropped, clean, heavy, irrefutable. It was the kind of question that didn't seek an answer. It demanded a reckoning. Governor Newsom stood still, blinking, just once, as if something had landed on his shoulder that he wasn't ready to feel. No reply. A low murmur flickered across the crowd, like wind brushing dry leaves. You could see it in the way people started to shift, not out of impatience but discomfort, the kind that comes when moral high ground collapses beneath your feet. In the second row, a woman in a navy dress raised a tissue to her face. It was subtle. Most would have missed it, but the camera didn't. Her hand trembled as she wiped beneath her eyes. She didn't sob. She didn't speak. She just looked up at the screen still showing Sergeant Eli Brooks, staring forward, still, dignified. Behind her, a man leaned forward, elbows on knees, hands clasped so tightly his knuckles turned white. His dog tags hung beneath his shirt, glinting as they caught the stage light. The moderator, visibly tense now, shuffled her cue cards. Her eyes bounced between JD and Newsom, waiting for someone, anyone, to lighten the atmosphere. But it didn't come, because there was nothing light here. Newsom opened his mouth slightly, perhaps to restate the broader policy vision, perhaps to invoke numbers again, or legislation. But before the sentence could begin, JD calmly turned back toward the audience. His voice was quiet, but it filled the room. You want numbers? I'll give you one. 3. He held up 3 fingers. That's how many times Sergeant Brooks applied for shelter. 3 chances to treat a man with honor. 3 bureaucratic walls. 3 missed moments of decency. He lowered his hand. How many more? The moderator blinked twice, then quickly reached for her earpiece. In the production booth, someone whispered, "We need a break." A sharp cue was given. The house lights dipped slightly. The moderator leaned into her mic with forced composure. "We'll be right back after this brief commercial." JD lowered his gaze. Newsom didn't move. On the screen, the live broadcast faded into black. No music, no applause, just silence. The kind that doesn't fill a room, but exposes it. The kind that forces every viewer at home to shift in their seat, to glance sideways, to feel the weight of something they didn't expect to carry. In that pause, the story changed. It was no longer a battle of ideology or statistics. It was a question that echoed in every silent second that followed. Who do we choose to remember, and who do we let disappear? The break had begun, but no one watching felt relief. Only the quiet ache of truth, finally spoken. Before the underpass, before the tarp and the shopping cart, before the televised silence and the name heard across America, there was Fallujah. The year was 2006. The sun in Anbar province didn't rise so much as it blasted into being, burning through sand and steel, igniting the horizon with the kind of heat that melted time. In the daylight, everything hummed with menace, but it was the nights that carved themselves into Eli Brooks's bones. He wasn't a frontline shooter. He never called in airstrikes or stormed enemy compounds. He was a mechanic, a specialist. His job was to keep the convoys alive, Humvees, MRAPs, and supply trucks that ferried water, rations, and soldiers across roads where every pothole might hold death. On a clear December night, one of those holes did. Their convoy had just passed the old mosque on Route Whiskey. 4 vehicles wide, headlights off, just like always. Eli was riding middle vehicle, second in the stack, when the front axle of the lead Humvee shattered in a fireball so sudden it looked like daylight had been summoned underground. The blast tore open the vehicle like a tin can and flipped it on its side. The squad didn't scream. They didn't panic. They moved. Eli was already out of his own truck, dragging 2 bags of gear toward the burning wreckage. Inside the vehicle, through a haze of smoke and orange flame, he saw Staff Sergeant Velasquez, legs pinned, one eye swollen shut, bleeding fast. Eli slid through the flames, wrapped Velasquez's leg with a field dressing, and jammed 2 fingers into the groin artery to keep pressure. 3 bullets cracked overhead. 2 ricocheted off the hood. The third hit the dirt near Eli's boot. He didn't flinch. He kept counting the seconds. 60 to stabilize, 30 to haul, 10 more to get clear. That was how you survived in Fallujah. Back at the outpost after the medevac, the silence was worse than the noise. Eli sat on an overturned ammo crate, soaked in another man's blood. No one said thank you. No one had to. They handed him a bottled water and sat in the dirt next to him. That was how respect worked out there, without words. By the end of that deployment, Eli had done that kind of work 6 times, 6 nights when something exploded and he ran toward it instead of away. 6 times he patched human beings back together with nothing but gauze and adrenaline and the prayer that the enemy's reload time would be just slow enough. But for all the chaos of the battlefield, what stayed with Eli the most wasn't the sound of bombs. It was the quiet, the hour after, when the fire died down, when the blood stopped pumping, when he'd crawl into his rack, stare at the roof of the tent, and realize the only thing louder than gunfire was the sound of coming home, already starting to haunt him. And yet he did come home. He landed in California on a rainy Thursday. The tarmac was gray, no flags, no cameras, just a clipboard and a long line of returning bodies. No one asked him what he'd seen. No one asked what he'd lost. He was handed a folder, inside a discharge sheet, a list of job retraining programs, and a $20 meal voucher. By Monday, he was back in Bakersfield, and by Wednesday, he was waking up in a stranger's garage, sweating through his shirt at 2 a.m., clutching a wrench like it was still a weapon. Fallujah was half a world away, but it had followed him home, and it wasn't done with him yet. California didn't wave a flag when Eli Brooks came home. It didn't hold a sign or offer a handshake. It offered a clipboard. The first day back, he stood in line at the Bakersfield 5A with the other returnees, most of them still wearing dust-covered boots. The woman at the front desk didn't look up when he handed over his documents. She just stapled them and said, "Next window." The second window told him his discharge papers were incomplete. "We need final verification from the Department of Defense," they said. "It usually comes through by the next quarter." That was in April. Eli had no permanent address, no phone number, no bank account, just a duffel bag, a limp knee, and a letter of commendation signed by a man who died 2 weeks after signing it. He stayed in a motel for a week. Then his money ran out. Then he found the car. It was a used '98 Camry with peeling paint and a busted heater, bought off a guy in Tulare for $600 cash. For a while, that car was enough. He parked it behind a warehouse near Union Avenue. He kept a jug of water in the trunk and a knife under the seat. He cleaned up in gas station restrooms. At night, he sat in the driver's seat and waited for his mind to quiet. It rarely did. At the VA clinic in Fresno, he applied again for transitional housing. This time, they told him his application was pending regional processing. When he asked how long that would take, the clerk shrugged. Could be a month, could be 6. One night, a tow truck came. He had parked in the wrong lot, and the city impounded the Camry. He didn't argue. He just watched it disappear behind the fence, headlights flickering as if waving goodbye. The next morning, Eli walked south for 3 hours with everything he owned strapped across his back. His duffel now held only a change of clothes, a stained sleeping bag, and a plastic folder with 2 documents, his DD-214 and his VA case number, printed in faded ink at the top of a half-completed intake form. By nightfall, he was sleeping under the 24th Street overpass. The first night was cold. The second was colder. On the third, he met Russell, another vet, Marine Corps, Beirut, 1983. They didn't talk much, but Russell gave him half a sandwich and a blanket that smelled like smoke and earth. Weeks passed, then months. He walked from shelter to shelter, asking for help. Most were full. Some weren't accepting new clients. Others required proof of residence. He chuckled at that. Proof of where you don't live so you can get somewhere to live. Once a caseworker told him, "You need to re-enter the system." Eli stared at him and replied, "I never left the system. It left me." He got a small tent eventually, duct taped around the edges, and some wooden pallets to keep it off the wet concrete. He learned to collect bottles for cash, learned which gas stations allowed you to refill water, which alleys were safe, which voices to avoid. Every now and then, he'd walk past the county office and see a campaign poster smiling down at him from a window. "We're building a California for everyone," it read. Eli looked up once, sun in his eyes, then looked back down at his feet. He didn't hate the state. He didn't even blame the governor, but he had stopped expecting them to remember, because somewhere between the battlefield and the bureaucrat, the return home had been lost, and he was still waiting for it to happen. The sun was just beginning to drop behind the western ridge of Bakersfield when J.D. Vance stepped out of the black SUV and closed the door gently behind him. No cameras, no entourage. Just him, a staffer in the passenger seat, and the dust beginning to settle on his polished shoes. The encampment wasn't marked on any map. You had to know where to look, and more importantly, who to ask without sounding like you were looking for a photo op. It sat beneath a rusted overpass off 24th and Edison Highway, wedged between dry brush and the forgotten edge of a rail line. There were 6 tents, 2 tarps, a mattress without a frame, and the unmistakable smell of burnt plastic and oil smoke clinging to the breeze. He walked slowly, head slightly lowered, not out of shame, but respect. He didn't want to be noticed before he noticed them. That's when he saw Eli. The man was crouched by a blue nylon tent, carefully unfolding a military-issue wool blanket. Across from him, propped up against a stack of old crates, sat a younger man with a limp and eyes that looked too old for his face. J.D. couldn't hear the words, but he saw the motion. Eli wrapping the blanket around the man's shoulders, then patting his arm twice. It wasn't grand, it wasn't dramatic, but it was kind, and it was steady. J.D. waited until Eli stood again, then approached. His footsteps crunched against the gravel. Eli turned but didn't seem surprised. He squinted toward the fading light, recognizing the silhouette before the face. "You're the guy from TV," he said. It wasn't a question. J.D. nodded. "I'm not here for a headline." "That's good," Eli replied, "'cause we ran out of those a long time ago." For a moment, neither said anything. The traffic overhead rumbled faintly, like a sky with a heartbeat. J.D. stepped closer, taking in the surroundings: makeshift clotheslines, duct-tape tents, a pile of paperbacks in a plastic crate. Someone had painted an American flag on the concrete pillar. The red had faded into rust. "I came to talk about policy," J.D. said after a pause, voice low, almost reverent. "But I'm leaving with a story this country forgot." Eli studied him carefully, then shrugged. "We ain't hard to find, just hard to look at." J.D.'s eyes moved to the mattress in the dirt, the collection of empty pill bottles arranged like trophies on a windowsill of cinder blocks. He swallowed hard. "Do you ever hear from the state?" he asked. Eli chuckled. "Just once, dry and tired." "Yeah, they came last winter. Dropped off a few flyers. One of them blew away before they even left." J.D. sighed, not in performance, but something heavier. He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded sheet of paper. It was Eli's case file. He had requested it days ago, but he didn't hand it over. Instead, he folded it back again, returned it to his pocket, and looked the man in the eye. "I don't know how long I'll be in office," J.D. said quietly. "But while I'm there, I want you to know, you're not invisible." Eli didn't smile, but his jaw shifted like something behind it had softened just a little. He reached into his back pocket, pulled out a small rectangle of brass, tarnished but still legible. His dog tags. He held them out for J.D. to see, but didn't offer them. "I keep them," Eli said. "Not so people remember I served. I keep them so I don't forget I still exist." J.D. nodded, and in that forgotten corner of a city that had long stopped listening, 2 men stood without fanfare, one carrying a title, the other carrying the silence of a nation. And for once, neither turned away. The clip hit the internet before the moderator could take off her mic. Within an hour, the final 10 minutes of the town hall, J.D.'s calm takedown, Newsom's hesitation, the crowd's stunned silence, had been cut, captioned, and shared across every corner of social media. Someone titled it, "The Night Compassion Went Quiet." Another post simply read, "He named a Marine. Newsom named no one." By midnight, it had over 3 million views. By morning, it was August 7th. Veterans groups began sharing it. Small-town newspapers picked it up. On AM radio in Missouri, a caller choked up on air saying, "That was my brother's story, just a different freeway." By the next afternoon, JD's poll numbers in Rust Belt states jumped 5 points. Meanwhile, Gavin Newsom's team scrambled. Their initial press release dismissed the exchange as a staged ambush during what was meant to be a bipartisan policy discussion. A campaign advisor called JD's remarks emotionally exploitative and misleading. But the messaging didn't land. Not this time. Because this time, there was a face, a name. A man who wasn't screaming or angry, just tired. The kind of tired no talking point could fix. Then JD dropped the second wave. It came quietly. A single post on his official account. No press conference, no TV cameras. Just a scanned document and a caption. The document was Eli Brooks' DD-214, his official discharge paper, worn but legible, showing 2 combat tours, honorable status, and service medals. The caption read, "He kept us safe." Who's keeping him? It went viral in minutes. The comments poured in. "I'm crying at my desk. I know this man. We all do. I voted Newsom last time, not again. I'm a Democrat, but JD Vance is the only one who's looked us in the eye lately." On Capitol Hill, JD kept his head down. When asked by reporters whether he planned to capitalize on the moment, he answered plainly, "This isn't about winning. It's about not forgetting." But inside the governor's office in Sacramento, the mood had shifted. Newsom's staff worked overtime to reframe the narrative. They pushed out photos of the governor visiting a veterans memorial 2 years prior. They floated op-eds defending California's holistic human rights approach. They cited the billions in aid directed toward underserved communities, including veterans. But it was too late, because none of it featured Eli. Not one post, not one photo, not one word about the man under the overpass with 2 combat tours and no mailing address. Cable news turned the moment into a 3-day frenzy. Analysts argued over federal versus state obligations, the ethics of calling out individuals, and whether JD had just outflanked the moral left from the right. But viewers weren't tuning in for the commentary. They were rewatching that moment, over and over again. The stillness, the way JD had said Eli's name without theatrics, the way Newsom blinked but never responded. That silence had become louder than any policy. And while campaign strategists debated ad buys and voter models across the country, in quiet kitchens and truck cabs and VFW halls, Americans weren't talking about politics. They were talking about the man with the blanket and the country that let him slip through the cracks. 3 days after the town hall, the headlines were beginning to cycle. The frenzy was starting to cool. News outlets moved on to other races, other scandals. JD Vance hadn't posted in 48 hours. The silence felt strategic, almost suspicious. And then, on a quiet Thursday morning, it happened. At exactly 9:02 a.m. Eastern, JD's team uploaded a PDF to his official website and shared the link with a caption so understated it almost seemed rhetorical. What we found. No hashtags, no flags, no speech, just the document. It was a 67-page internal audit completed by California's Department of Veteran Services in 2019, marked confidential, titled plainly, Analysis of Allocated versus Expended Veteran Housing and Care Funds. Fiscal year 2018 to 2019. Buried deep on page 34 was the number, $52,168,000. Unspent. Allocated for housing, therapy programs, mobile clinics, job training grants, never distributed, no explanation given, no plan for reallocation. The funds had simply lapsed, rolled back into the general budget at the end of the fiscal year. In the same fiscal year, 1,892 veterans in California applied for emergency shelter. Over 40% were denied for lack of availability. The internet ignited. Red state, blue state, didn't matter. Veterans forums, independent journalists, former staffers, all started digging. A spreadsheet was unearthed showing dozens of delayed disbursements marked pending review. In the margins of one scanned page, a handwritten note, not a priority this quarter. That same afternoon, JD appeared live on C-SPAN from a Senate press room. No podium, no theatrics, just him holding the audit in one hand and Eli Brooks's photo in the other. He stepped to the mic. In 2019, California had $52 million they told the public was going to help veterans. You want to know where it went? He lifted the paper higher. It went nowhere. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. It sat in accounts while veterans like Sergeant Brooks were denied housing, care, and dignity. Not because the state didn't have the funds, but because someone in a chair with a stapler decided they had better things to do. He let the words settle, then asked directly, Governor Newsom, where did it go? The room of reporters, mostly silent, began scribbling. One raised a hand, but JD had already folded the document and stepped away. That night, every major outlet ran the story. CNN, unspent millions in vet funds sparks outrage. Fox News, audit bombshell. California left vets behind? Even NPR ran a segment titled, When Promises Become Paperwork. The Newsom administration issued a brief statement. We are reviewing the claims in Senator Vance's press conference and will comment once we've assessed the authenticity of the documents. But no denial came. In Sacramento, the press secretary dodged questions. In Bakersfield, reporters interviewed other homeless veterans, many with similar stories. Housing applications lost, appeals delayed, clinics overbooked. And across the country, something shifted. Because this wasn't just a viral moment anymore. It wasn't a soundbite or a single name. It was a number, a dollar amount, a provable wound. It was proof that Eli Brooks hadn't fallen through the cracks. He'd been quietly shoved through them by a system too tangled to admit its own failure. And Gavin Newsom? He said nothing. In every interview that week, he was asked the same question. And each time he smiled tightly, redirected the conversation, and moved on. But the silence only grew louder. Because somewhere under an overpass, a man had laid on concrete, while the money meant for him collected dust in a budget no one bothered to open. And now the country had seen the receipts. There was no anthem playing when J.D. Vance walked into the Veterans of Foreign Wars Hall in Gallipolis, Ohio. No cameras, no podium lights, no press. The carpet was frayed, the chairs mismatched, and the smell of old coffee lingered in the air like a familiar companion. A hand-painted banner near the back wall read, Gallia County Vets, Still Standing. There were 43 people in the room, most of them older. Some wore caps with insignia from Korea, Vietnam, or Afghanistan. One man had a cane shaped like a rifle barrel. Another wore a service dog vest, even though he didn't bring a dog. JD didn't bring a speech. He walked to the front of the room, nodded toward the flag in the corner, and looked out at the faces. Most stared back with the quiet skepticism of people who had heard every kind of promise and watched most of them evaporate. JD didn't promise anything. He just began to read. I received this letter 2 nights ago, he said, pulling a single sheet of paper from the inside pocket of his jacket. It was handwritten by a woman in Chillicothe. Her name is Ruth Wallace. She's 94 years old. She asked me not to read it on television, but she said I could read it to people who'd understand. He unfolded it carefully and held it with both hands. Senator Vance, my husband Arthur, fought in Normandy. He came home with shrapnel in his leg and never once complained. He worked in a sawmill until he was 73. He believed in quiet service. He believed the country would always look out for those who bled for it. He passed 10 years ago. I watched the clip of you speaking that man's name, Eli Brooks. I don't know him, but I know that look. My husband would have been proud of your stand. Thank you for remembering them, when the rest of the country seems to forget. Ruth Wallace J.D. looked up. No one clapped, not right away. They just sat there, breathing in the silence, letting the weight of the words settle. A woman near the back wiped her cheek. A man in a wheelchair nodded slowly. Then, without prompting, a veteran in the front row stood. He didn't say a word. He just straightened his back and saluted. One by one, others followed. Old knees struggled, joints creaked, but they rose. Some stood in uniform, some in jeans and work boots, but all stood, not for JD, not for a party, but for the feeling that someone had finally spoken their language. There was no music, no chanting, no cheering, just the sound of boots scraping against tile, hands over hearts, and a silence that honored more than applause ever could. J.D. folded the letter carefully and returned it to his pocket. Then he looked across the room and said, "The system doesn't need fixing, it needs remembering." That was it. No slogans, no fundraising, just truth, spoken plainly in a hall that had seen too many ceremonies for men who never got their due. As he stepped down and shook hands on his way out, a man with silver hair leaned in and whispered, "Don't stop. You're not just saying what we feel, you're saying what we've buried." Outside it was dusk. No crowd waited. Just a quiet flag rippling above the gravel lot and a cause that was no longer his alone. The town hall had ended, but its aftershocks hadn't. J.D. Vance's calm confrontation was still ricocheting across every news outlet and dinner table. The clip of him saying Sergeant Brooks's name had racked up nearly 20 million views in under a week. Commentators were calling it the moment the race turned emotional. Campaigns were quietly rewriting their strategies. And then the next bomb dropped. It was a short clip, only 27 seconds long, but it struck harder than any policy paper ever could. It opened in a dim backstage hallway behind the Civic Center. Fluorescent lighting, peeling paint, and the sound of footsteps on tile. A junior staffer's phone, filming low, half hidden behind a campaign folder. The voice came in clear. "That hillbilly pulled a sympathy stunt on live TV." The voice was unmistakable. Gavin Newsom. He wasn't shouting, but the venom behind the words cut deeper than volume ever could. His jacket was slung over his arm, his face flushed. He waved off a bottle of water handed to him. "Did you see the moderator's face? Completely lost control. That's what you get when you let people bring emotion into a policy conversation. It's amateur hour." Another staffer nervously chuckled. "Should we respond?" Newsom scoffed. "No, let it die. Nobody cares about some burned-out mechanic with a tent and a sob story. It's just a headline. It'll pass." The screen went black. That was all it took. Within hours, the clip was everywhere. "Did Newsom really say hillbilly?" read the New York Post headline. "Governor's dismissive tirade leaked. Insults homeless vet on camera," wrote Politico. Hashtag Hillbillygate began trending on Twitter. TikTok creators spliced the clip over footage of Eli Brooks handing a blanket to another veteran. Instagram feeds filled with side-by-side screenshots of Newsom's public sympathy versus his private scorn. The fury didn't split along party lines. Veterans groups condemned the remark. Local radio hosts who had never once covered national politics aired the audio on loop. Callers broke down in tears. A Marine Corps widow from Texas posted a 2-minute response video. "My husband was a hillbilly. He saved 4 men in Helmand Province. You wouldn't last 5 minutes in his boots." Even within Newsom's own circles, there was panic. A senior campaign advisor resigned quietly the next day. Donors canceled events. A California-based veteran support organization withdrew its endorsement, stating, "We stand with respect, not rhetoric." The governor's press team issued a written statement. Governor Newsom regrets the tone and language used in a private moment of frustration and reiterates his deep respect for our veteran community. But it wasn't the tone people were angry about, it was the truth behind it. J.D. Vance didn't comment publicly, he didn't post, he didn't grant interviews, he didn't need to. America was already speaking for him. Eli Brooks was never mentioned in the clip, but he didn't need to be. Everyone watching knew who that hillbilly was. They saw him every time they passed a man on a sidewalk wearing a camo jacket too thin for winter. Every time a flag waved over a VA clinic with a 6-month wait list. Every time a silence at a funeral wasn't filled by anything except another folded triangle of red, white, and blue. In one sentence, Gavin Newsom had undone every polished word he'd said on stage. And for the first time in his career, no amount of messaging could mop up the damage. The debate was over. Now it was personal. And the country was no longer asking who was right. They were asking something colder. Who was real? There was no studio, no lighting rig, no flag-draped backdrop, just a bare garage in Middletown, Ohio, the sound of crickets outside, and a single desk lamp casting long shadows across the cement floor. A Craftsman tool chest stood in the corner. A lawnmower sat quietly behind him. At 8 p.m., sharp, J.D. Vance went live. No press release, no countdown, just a camera, a chair, and a message that needed no polish. "Evening," he said plainly. "I figured after the last few days, we could all use a little less noise." His voice was calm, but there was something weightier behind it, like a man carrying stories too heavy for slogans. He wore no tie, just a flannel shirt, sleeves rolled to his forearms. On the table beside him sat a small, dented silver case. He opened it gently and held up a military service medal, faded bronze, ribbon fraying at the edges. "This belonged to Sergeant Eli Brooks," JD said. "He didn't give it to me. I asked to borrow it." He turned it slowly between his fingers, letting the silence breathe. "I've spent the past few weeks meeting men like Eli. Not in campaign stops, not on stages, but on sidewalks, in clinics, at the edge of grocery store parking lots." He paused, then looked directly into the camera. "I want to tell you about 5 of them." The screen didn't cut. No B-roll, just JD, the medal in his hand, and the weight of his words. First was Tom, Navy vet, served in Desert Storm. He lives in a van behind a diner in Riverside. He's got 3rd-degree burns on his leg from a cooking fire. When I asked what he needed, he said, "More socks and a doctor who answers the damn phone." He set the medal down gently. Then there's Charles, Army, lost both legs in an IED attack in Kandahar. He applied for state-funded housing assistance 4 times, still pending review. Lives in his sister's garage. Hasn't been outside in 2 weeks. His voice didn't break, but his jaw clenched. There's Maria, yes, a woman, served with the Marines. Single mother now. Sleeps in her car while her daughter stays with an aunt. She's got PTSD and a service dog named Max, but she doesn't qualify for assistance because the car technically counts as housing. He looked down for a moment, then continued. There's James, Vietnam vet, 68, lives in a tent outside San Jose, has cancer. He told me the hospital wait list was 6 months. Guess I'll just hope it's slow moving, he said. He lifted the medal again, thumb brushing the inscription. And then there's one more. A kid named Darnell, 27, Afghanistan. Got back less than a year ago, already on the street. I asked him what his plan was. He said, I had one. They lost the paperwork. The stream was quiet, no comments flashing, no distractions, just that face, solemn, weathered, resolute. I'm not here to raise money tonight, JD said softly. I'm not here to go after a governor or a party or a poll. He leaned forward. I'm here because I've seen what we've turned our heroes into. Forms, files, denials. And because I believe that if we're not brave enough to fix it, then we sure as hell better be brave enough to face it. He reached for the medal one last time, held it up to the lens and spoke in a voice barely louder than a whisper. He didn't ask to be honored. He asked to be seen. Then he ended the stream. No music, no outro, no campaign logo, just silence. And across the country, thousands of screens went dark, while one truth stayed burning. It was posted on a Sunday morning, early before most people had poured their first cup of coffee. No press release, no caption thread, no official hashtag, just one photo and one line. The image was grainy, clearly taken on a phone. No filters, no staging, just Eli Brooks sitting in a folding chair inside a VA waiting room, his back slightly hunched, hands resting between his knees. His eyes stared straight ahead, not at the camera, but at a pale blank wall. No posters, no flags, just chipped white paint and silence. The lighting was flat, harsh, fluorescent. Above the image, JD wrote, They gave him freedom. We gave him silence. That was it. No anger, no names, no politics. And somehow that made it impossible to ignore. Within an hour, it had 11,000 shares. By lunchtime, it had surpassed 1 million. 24 hours later, it had been reposted over 4 million times. Not just by political pages or activist groups, but by teachers, truckers, retirees, Gold Star families, even influencers who'd never said a word about veterans before. It wasn't outrage that fueled the momentum, it was recognition. Because Eli could have been any one of them, or someone they knew, a neighbor, a cousin, a face glimpsed outside the grocery store and forgotten by the time the car engine turned over. And now he couldn't be unseen. JD didn't comment further. He didn't clarify. The image stood on its own, unflinching and still. For once, the nation didn't argue. It reflected. In Seattle, a veterans shelter reported triple the number of volunteer signups in a single day. In Tulsa, a high school history teacher printed the post and taped it to his chalkboard with the words, "Discuss Monday." In a small diner in Georgia, someone left a copy of the photo folded neatly inside the tip jar. The ripple effects weren't loud. They weren't orchestrated, but they were everywhere. Even media outlets that had previously tried to pivot away from the story circled back. MSNBC ran a segment called "The Wall We Made Him Face." Fox News ran theirs under "A Nation's Quiet Failure." CNN aired a panel where a VA administrator broke down and said, "We thought we were helping. I don't know anymore." Inside the governor's office in Sacramento, the tension thickened. Newsom's team scrambled to produce a new video showing the governor visiting a veterans facility. It was glossy, well-lit, and well-edited. But when it went live, the comment section filled instantly, not with praise, but with copies of the same photo JD had posted over and over again. Some included nothing more than the word, "Look." That night, JD's team was flooded with interview requests. They declined them all. Instead, they released a quiet statement. There's nothing left to explain. The country saw what it needed to see. Back in Bakersfield, Eli didn't know about the post at first. He didn't have a smartphone. A younger vet showed him the image on an old tablet someone donated. Eli looked at it for a long time, expression unreadable. Then he muttered, "Guess I was right to sit still." Later that evening, JD called him. "I owe you an apology," JD said. "You asked to be seen, not displayed." Eli chuckled dryly. "Son, I've been invisible for 20 years. If one picture makes them feel it, just once, maybe we're getting somewhere." JD didn't respond, because there was nothing to add. The words had already been written. The silence had already been heard. By Monday morning, the front steps of the California State Capitol were no longer just home to tourists and lobbyists. They had become something else entirely, a gathering place for the forgotten. Dozens of veterans stood side by side beneath the marble columns, wearing worn jackets, campaign ribbons, and ball caps embroidered with names of wars most Americans had stopped remembering. Some carried flags folded tight under their arms. Others held signs with black marker scrawled over cardboard. "Honor before optics. Don't thank me, house me." You remember the flag? Do you remember us? Local news helicopters circled overhead. Journalists camped outside the gates. Camera crews jockeyed for position near the steps. But none of the veterans spoke for sound bites. They stood still, silent, their presence louder than any chant. Inside the Capitol, Governor Gavin Newsom's office pulsed with tension. His press secretary was fielding back-to-back calls. The chief of staff was hunched over polling memos that no longer made sense. And the governor, once the most media-savvy man in the building, sat behind his desk staring at a printed copy of JD's one-sentence post. He had seen worse scandals. He had ridden out firestorms before. But this was different. This wasn't policy. It was personal. And it wouldn't go away. Every time he tried to pivot toward clean energy, budget surpluses, public health, someone would bring it back. Sergeant Brooks. The $52 million. The word hillbilly. The clip had reshaped how people looked at him, not as a governor, but as a man. His approval rating had dropped 9 points in 6 days. Even his allies were beginning to whisper behind closed doors. One by one, they began to suggest what no one wanted to say aloud. "You need to meet with him." At first, Newsom refused. He said it would legitimize the attack, give JD a headline, let him look like the adult in the room. But the pressure didn't let up. More veterans arrived at the Capitol each day. Eli Brooks had become a national symbol. His face, still, weathered, watching a wall, was etched into the conscience of a country that suddenly couldn't look away. By Thursday, the governor relented. He didn't hold a press conference. He didn't tweet. He sent a private message through back channels. The message reached JD's team just before noon. "The governor will meet. 1 hour, no media, no statements." JD didn't ask for more. He accepted. The meeting was scheduled for Friday at 10 a.m. in a small wood-paneled room behind the governor's office, used mostly for internal budget briefings. No press were allowed inside, no aides, just the two men and a wall of silence between them that had taken the shape of a nation. Outside, the protests continued. Veterans stood shoulder to shoulder, even as the clouds rolled in. A storm was coming, but they didn't flinch. They had stood through worse. At 9:57 a.m., Gavin Newsom left his office and walked the short hallway alone. He wore a dark gray suit, no tie. In his hand was a folder, not thick, not dramatic, but held tightly like a man bringing something he didn't want to drop. JD was already inside, standing by the window, hands folded calmly. They nodded at each other. No handshake, no cameras. Just two seats at a long oak table, and a conversation the country would never hear. But one it had been waiting for. The door clicked shut behind them, and the room exhaled into quiet. The space was small, surprisingly unceremonious for two of the most watched figures in the country. No flags, no cameras, just four dark-paneled walls, a carafe of water on a side table, and an oak conference table stretching between them like a line neither wanted to cross. J.D. Vance didn't sit right away. He stood at the far end, his coat folded neatly over one chair, his expression unreadable. Gavin Newsom walked to the opposite end, slower than usual, posture tighter than his public persona allowed. He pulled out a chair, paused, then sat down. J.D. followed a beat later, folding into his seat without a word. The silence lingered. Then J.D. reached into his coat pocket and placed a small dented case on the table. He opened it without drama, revealing the same tarnished military service medal he'd held in his live stream days earlier. The ribbon was still frayed, the metal still dulled by time and weather and war. He turned it once between his fingers, then set it in the center of the table, closer to Newsom than himself. "You know what this is," J.D. said. His voice was steady, low. "But I don't think you know who it belonged to." Newsom didn't speak. His eyes drifted to the metal, but not for long. J.D. reached into his folder and pulled out a photograph, old, grainy, but unmistakably real. Three men in desert camo, dust-covered boots, their arms slung across each other's shoulders with the casual confidence of soldiers who'd survived something together. One was Eli Brooks, the other two now gone. He slid the photo across the table with two fingers. It stopped just short of the metal. "These are the men he watched die. One bled out in his lap. The other was vaporized by an IED. Eli held what was left of him in a poncho for 7 hours until medevac arrived. Newsom's fingers twitched on the edge of the table. Still, he said nothing. J.D. leaned forward, not aggressively, but with the gravity of someone who'd carried these words longer than he ever wanted to. "Would you have let your own son sleep under a bridge?" The sentence fell like a stone in still water. No echo, just impact. Newsom flinched, not with his body, but something smaller. His eyes narrowed slightly, his lips parted, but no words came. J.D. didn't blink. "Because that's what this is, Gavin. It's not about policy. It's not about budgets. It's not about optics or strategy or political cycles. It's about a man who wore that medal and watched this state step over him like he was trash." Newsom's mouth closed again. He looked at the photo, then the medal, then the table itself, as if searching for something there. Maybe a line he could still walk back across. J.D. exhaled softly. "You called it a sympathy stunt," he said. "It wasn't. It was a reckoning." The governor's hand reached toward the photo, hesitated, then pulled back. A full minute passed without either man speaking. Outside, the low murmur of protesters continued beneath the Capitol steps, muffled by walls but undeniable. Finally, J.D. stood. He left the medal where it sat. He took the photograph. And as he opened the door to leave, he paused just long enough to say, without anger but without softness, "He earned more than your silence." Then he was gone, and Newsom sat alone at the table, with a tarnished symbol of sacrifice staring back at him. And no words left to bury it. The letter appeared 2 days later. It wasn't posted on social media. It wasn't announced with press conferences or TV teasers. It simply landed, quietly but purposefully, on the front page of Stars and Stripes, beneath a black and white photograph of folded American flags resting in the arms of quiet hands. The headline was simple: An Open Letter to the Nation I Still Believe in, by Senator J.D. Vance. There was no party affiliation printed beside his name, no call to action, just words that carried the weight of something more enduring than outrage. This isn't about politics, and the letter began. It's about promises, the kind that were made in the dirt, on the battlefield, and in the hearts of men and women who came home with more scars than souvenirs. JD's voice was plain-spoken, but each line carried the precision of someone who'd thought it all through and refused to look away. We send young Americans overseas with rifles in their hands and hope in their hearts. We promise them that if they make it home, they will be honored, not just with medals, but with care, with shelter, with dignity. But for too many, that promise died somewhere between the battlefield and the bureaucrat's desk. He didn't mention Gavin Newsom by name. He didn't have to. We've heard the excuses, we've seen the budget charts and the press statements, but none of that explains why a Marine with 2 tours sleeps beneath an overpass while funds meant to help him gather dust in state coffers. Across the country, in VA clinics and truck stops and kitchen tables where yellowed newspaper clippings still hung beside flags, people stopped to read. If we can't care for those who defended our soil, how can we claim to lead it? Leadership is not the art of looking good. It's the burden of showing up when no one's clapping. He told the story of Eli Brooks again, briefly this time, just enough to remind the reader that this wasn't a symbol. It was a man who gave, and then was told he didn't exist in the right zip code to be helped. We don't need another commission. We need courage. Courage to fund shelters before slogans. Courage to hire caseworkers before consultants. Courage to remember, not just on Veterans Day, but every single day, who paid for the freedom we tweet about and take for granted. Near the end, the tone shifted slightly. Not softer, but more open. More invitation than indictment. This isn't just a California failure, it's an American one. And fixing it will take more than one senator, or one governor, or one election cycle. It'll take all of us deciding that no one who wore the uniform should ever have to beg to be seen. He signed it with his full name. No title, no office. Just J.D. Vance, son of Ohio, servant of memory. Within hours, the letter was reprinted in dozens of local papers. Veterans groups across the country shared it on their websites. It was read aloud in a church in Alabama and printed on the wall of a community center in Montana. He hadn't written it to go viral. He wrote it because silence, even when strategic, can begin to feel like betrayal. And J.D. Vance knew that for every Eli Brooks who was named, there were 100 others still in shadow, waiting for someone to prove that dignity didn't require a headline, just a promise someone meant to keep. It began not with a press conference or a slogan, but with a quiet meeting in a third-floor office tucked inside the Russell Senate building. J.D. Vance sat at the table, sleeves rolled up, legal pads spread in front of him like blueprints. The windows were open, letting in the early spring air. Around the table sat a strange mix of allies, Republicans from rural states, Democrats from post-industrial cities, and 2 independent senators who usually kept their heads low in the culture wars. What united them, at least for now, was the image of a man sitting quietly in a folding chair, staring at a wall. They called it the Eli Brooks Act. It was never supposed to be sweeping. It was meant to be specific, targeted, impossible to ignore. Its central tenet was simple. Any veteran who has served honorably would be prioritized above non-citizens in access to publicly funded housing, health care, and emergency state aid. The language was sharp but careful. It didn't demonize immigrants. It didn't call for funding cuts. It simply reordered the promise, putting those who had defended the country at the front of the line. J.D. knew what the headlines would say before the ink was dry. And he was right. Within 48 hours of the first draft being circulated, the backlash began. Vance introduces Veteran First Bill. Critics call it anti-immigrant. Progressive lawmakers slam new bill. Compassion shouldn't come with conditions. The Eli Brooks Act, justice or jingoism. Cable panels lit up. Social media fractured down the expected lines. Hashtags exploded. Hashtag justice for Eli. Hashtag veterans first. Hashtag no human second. Protesters held signs that said dignity isn't a competition and compassion has no border. JD said little in response. He just kept working. The bill gained momentum in surprising places. A Democratic senator from Michigan signed on after visiting a VA clinic and hearing a Vietnam vet whisper, "So I have to move to another country to be remembered?" A conservative from Utah, known for avoiding controversy, gave a floor speech saying, "I voted against every one of Vance's major proposals, until this one." By the end of the first week, the bill had 15 bipartisan co-sponsors. Still, the fire burned hotter. Editorials praised JD for naming what others were too careful to admit. Others accused him of using a veteran as a political weapon. Some claimed the bill was symbolic, unlikely to pass, a gesture more than a solution. JD didn't argue. He showed data, dozens of case files submitted by staffers across the country. Veterans denied shelter, delayed in treatment, or told to wait behind newer applicants because they didn't meet certain eligibility criteria. He read them aloud in committee meetings, not with anger, but with the weight of someone who had seen too much to forget. And then he'd pause, look around the room and ask, "Is that what we meant by thank you for your service?" The room always went quiet. Back in Bakersfield, Eli was still sleeping in the same tent, though now it sat beneath a tarp someone had replaced with sturdier canvas. He didn't follow the debates closely, but one morning a social worker handed him a copy of the bill. He ran a finger over his name and the title. Then he folded it carefully, slid it into a Ziploc bag, and tucked it under his cot. "I ain't a cause," he said later, "but if they build something from my wreckage, maybe it means I wasn't just noise." The Eli Brooks Act wasn't law yet, but it had already changed the conversation, and the line between forgotten and first was no longer so easy to ignore. The chamber was nearly full, rare for a midweek session, and unusually quiet. J.D. Vance stood alone at the podium, his speech folded once in his hand but left unopened. He didn't look down. He didn't need to. The words he carried weren't written last night. They had been with him since the folding chair, since the medal on the table, since Eli Brooks said nothing and made the whole country listen. He began without ceremony. "I didn't grow up in Washington. I didn't grow up with a security detail or a polished accent. I grew up watching my grandfather pace the porch at night, trying to remember things he wanted to forget." Some senators shifted in their seats. Others leaned in. "I was taught that service meant sacrifice, that the men and women who wore our country's uniform didn't do it for praise. They did it because they believed in something bigger than themselves. And we told them we'd have their back." He paused. The silence filled in like breath. "And then they came home." He held up a piece of notebook paper, creased, water-stained. "This is a letter I received last week. It's from a man in Kansas. No return address, just signed with initials." He began to read. "I fought in Kandahar. I shouldn't have to fight for soap. I go to the shelter and they tell me they're full. I go to the clinic and they tell me I don't have the right paperwork. I sleep under a billboard that says, 'Support our troops.' I did my part. Where's the rest of the deal?" JD looked up. "He doesn't want a monument. He doesn't want a parade. He wants soap." There was no applause. This wasn't the moment for it. JD's voice dropped lower, steadier. "The Eli Brooks Act isn't about excluding anyone. It's about correcting something we've allowed to go numb. It's about making sure that the people who once stood between us and death don't have to stand in line behind people who've never worn the flag they defended." He scanned the room. "I've heard the arguments, that this bill is politically loaded, that it's inconvenient, that it might complicate allocations. You know what's more inconvenient? Watching a man who once held his friend's leg together in a war zone be denied a cot because the state ran out of beds." His hand rested on the edge of the podium. "Call it what you want. I call it a chance to keep a promise." He stepped back, folded the letter, tucked it inside his jacket pocket. No mic drop, no theatrics. Just a man who had said what he came to say. The clerk called the roll. One by one, the votes were cast. Some quick and confident, others hesitant. A few whispered like confessions. When the final tally lit up on the board, the chamber stirred. 62 to 38. The bill had passed. A brief murmur of applause broke through the silence. Some senators clapped. Others nodded solemnly. A few stared straight ahead, unsure whether they'd done enough or too little, too late. JD didn't smile. He didn't turn to the cameras. He just whispered a quiet thank you to no one in particular and walked back to his seat. That night, the Capitol dome glowed a little brighter. Not because anything had been fixed, but because, for once, a promise had been heard across the marble, the headlines and the years of excuses. And this time, it didn't end with a ceremony. It ended with a name finally honored and a door finally opened. The wall behind J.D. Vance's desk wasn't decorated with accolades or certificates. No framed degrees, no headlines in glass. Just a large corkboard map of the United States, stretched edge to edge, spotted with small colored pins, blue, red, white, and gold. Each pin told a story. Each one marked a name. The staff had started it months ago, almost as a way to keep track of the chaos. Every time a veteran called, emailed, or walked through the door with a story of being helped, through a shelter, a clinic, a hotline, or just being seen, someone would take a pin and gently push it into the place they came from. It wasn't part of any official program. There was no algorithm, just a quiet ritual that had come to mean more than the briefings, the binders, the endless procedural noise that filled Washington. That morning, the office was unusually still. No phones ringing, no aides buzzing around, just JD alone with the map, a cup of coffee gone cold, and a small gold pin in his palm. He looked at it for a long moment, rolling it between his thumb and forefinger. Then he leaned forward and pressed it into the cork, just off the I-5 freeway near Bakersfield. No label, no ribbon, just a pin, and just beside it, two others, one in Fresno, one along the coast, both added last week after follow-ups confirmed that the Eli Brooks Act had expedited approvals in housing centers, previously too overwhelmed to respond. But this one meant something different, because it wasn't about bureaucracy finally moving. It was about a man who never asked for a stage, never shouted, never demanded anything beyond being seen, and who, somehow, had managed to move the country without ever leaving the shadows. JD stepped back and looked at the map. Dozens of pins, dozens of names, a few clustered in Ohio, a long trail across the South, some in rural Montana, one in New York. None of them were victories, not in the political sense. No one was getting re-elected for these pins. But they mattered. He glanced down at his desk where the dog tags still sat, the ones Eli had shown him and refused to part with. They hadn't spoken in days. Eli didn't call for updates, didn't ask how the bill was doing. That wasn't who he was. But last week, a staffer sent JD a photo from a shelter director near Bakersfield. The tent was gone. In its place, a bunk, a locker, and a window with a view of nothing special, just a parking lot and a patch of grass. But on the window was taped something JD recognized instantly. A copy of the bill, the one with Eli's name in the title. JD didn't show the photo to the press. He didn't include it in speeches. He just printed it and slid it into a manila folder labeled Kept Promises, a folder that no one asked for, but that he kept anyway. Behind him, the door clicked open softly. A young aide stepped in, hesitated. "Senator, they're ready for you in the hearing room." JD nodded. He looked once more at the pin. Not as a politician, not as a public figure, just as someone who understood what it meant to finally put someone on the map, not with headlines, but with humanity. He turned off the desk lamp, picked up his notes, and left the room in silence. The pin stayed behind. But the story was moving forward. The chamber was packed. Reporters lined the back wall, pens hovering. Veterans sat in rows, silent but present, medals on faded jackets, memories heavier than applause. At the center, J.D. Vance tapped the gavel once. "This committee," he began, "was formed to follow the money." But it became something else. A mirror. He turned slightly. To his left, Governor Gavin Newsom, calm on the surface, jaw locked tight. To his right, Eli Brooks, clean-shaven, spine straight, wearing a worn suit borrowed from the shelter staff who'd called him Sergeant, even after he insisted they didn't have to. JD reached into his folder and pulled something small but unmistakable. Eli's medal. He didn't say a word as he walked it to the center of the long table. He placed it gently in front of the governor. "This," JD said quietly, "is the one report we forgot to file. The one that doesn't need a timestamp or a party line. Just eyes to see it and a heart willing to act." No one clapped. No one interrupted. Even the cameras seemed to pause. Newsom looked at the medal, not away, not through it, at it. Eli, still silent, nodded once. The hearing continued, but something had already been heard, not in words, in presence, and the whole country was watching. For a long moment, the room said nothing. Newsom shifted in his chair, then leaned toward the microphone. His voice came out rougher than expected. "I came here ready with numbers," he said, eyes not leaving the medal. "Charts, talking points, defense." He paused, then looked up, first at Eli, then at JD. "But I sat across from a man who slept under the freeway I drove on every week, and I didn't know his name. I didn't ask." His throat caught. The microphone picked up the breath he held a little too long. "I forgot you," he said, voice cracking. "I forgot too many." He didn't try to recover with a slogan, didn't pivot, didn't deflect, just folded his hands on the table and let it sit there. Eli nodded once. Not bitter, just seen. JD didn't gloat. He didn't move. He just turned slightly so the cameras could catch Eli's face. Steady, calm, absorbing more than the moment itself. And then, without a signal or command, the room stood. All of them. Republicans, Democrats, veterans, journalists, staffers who had never worn a uniform but felt like they were in one now. No clapping, no speeches, just silence. The kind that isn't empty, but full, of what was missed, of what was mended, and of what would never be forgotten again. The key turned with a soft click. Eli stepped into the small apartment. Nothing fancy, but clean, warm, and his. He stood still for a second, letting the silence fill his lungs like something sacred. On the kitchen table sat a folded American flag. He didn't touch it. He just looked, then nodded. Once, like a soldier answering a roll call no one else could hear. Across the country, other changes began to ripple. A veteran in Nevada embraced her daughter in front of a newly opened transitional home. In Mississippi, two brothers, both former Marines, stood beneath a banner that read, "Your service still matters." Their smiles were tired but real. Back in Ohio, J.D. Vance walked the quiet corridors of a VA hospital. No cameras, no press, just faces, some alert, others barely aware. He stopped by one door, left behind a small notebook with names he hadn't let the world forget. In voiceover, the words came, not triumphant but firm. This wasn't about shame. It was about memory. Because a nation isn't judged by its speeches, but by the promises it refuses to break. And some promises, at long last, had been remembered. This story reminds us that patriotism isn't loud. It's loyal. It lives in small actions, quiet courage, and the simple dignity of keeping a promise. J.D. Vance didn't just confront power. He gave voice to those America had forgotten. And in doing so, he reminded us that leadership starts with listening. What's one promise you believe this country should never break? If this story touches you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to JD Stories, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching JD Stories.